and a doctor standing before him and giving him facts and telling him that these methods that they're using to come to their conclusions are not scientific, telling him what the scientific approach would be to researching this issue. And you've got the chairman attacking him and throwing newspaper articles in his face as proof. Can you imagine, just for a minute, can you imagine 2012, Capitol Hill? You've got a Senate committee on, I don't know, any subject that's pertinent today. Let's say the illegal immigration issue. Can you imagine if rather than studying the actual facts and figures of the impact of illegal immigrants on our society, if our senators and congressmen simply picked up the newspaper and read whatever an editorial piece had to say, not a news story, an editorial. The key here is editorial, because an editorial is nothing more than opinion. So basically, what you have is a group of our legislators that are relying on the opinions of newspapermen to determine laws. Can you imagine if that took place today? Not that it doesn't, but can you imagine? And that was basically it. Yellow journalism won over medical science. The committee passed the legislation, and on the floor of the House, the entire discussion was, a member from upstate New York, Mr. Speaker, what is the bill about? Speaker Rayburn, I don't know. It has something to do with a thing called marijuana. I think it's a narcotic of some kind. Mr. Speaker, does the American Medical Association support this bill? Now, at that point, a member on the committee jumps up and says, their doctor, Wentworth, came down here. They support this bill 100%. Now, his name wasn't even Wentworth, okay? And this is directly from the congressional records. A member of the committee jumps up and says, their Dr. Wentworth came down here. They support this bill 100%. Now, folks, you don't have to believe me on this. Like we said in the introduction, we want you to research what we're telling you. We don't want you to take what we're telling you at face value. No more than we want you to take anything you're told at face value. We want you to think for yourselves. We want you to take the red pill, okay? Look this up. It's in the Library of Congress. It's a matter of congressional record. These quotes are still available today. In fact, they're more available today than they ever were because the Library of Congress is online now. Now, based on that lie, on August 2nd, 1937, marijuana became illegal at the federal level. The entire coverage in the New York Times, the President Roosevelt signed a bill today to curb traffic in the narcotic marijuana through heavy taxes on transactions. Anslinger essentially was the first drug czar of the United States, even though that term didn't exist until William Bennett took the position as director of the White House Office on National Drug Policy. But Anslinger, he acted in a similar fashion. The parallels between Anslinger and drug czar John Walters, who retired in 2009, are just uncanny. They both had the same kind of carte blanche to go around demonizing drugs and drug users. They both had large public podiums for their voices to be heard and to promote their own personal agendas. They both lied constantly, and sometimes when it wasn't even necessary. They were both racist. They both had the ear of Capitol Hill, and they both realized that they could persuade legislatures and others based on lies, particularly if they could co-opt the media into downplaying any opposing views. Anslinger even had the ability to circumvent the First Amendment. There was a Canadian movie called Drug Addict. It was a 1946 documentary that realistically depicted drug addicts and law enforcement officials. He got that movie banned in the United States. That's freedom of the press. That's freedom of speech. That's a violation of the First Amendment. But he got it on. He even tried to get the movie banned in Canada in their own country, or at least to get them to prevent U.S. citizens from coming to Canada and watching it. Of course, Canada laughed at him and refused. But John Walters tried to do the same thing up until 2009 by bullying Canada into keeping harsh marijuana laws. Now, we have to ask ourselves at this point, why would America for 70 plus years try to influence their neighbors' marijuana laws? Well, the answer is real simple. Because there are an amazing number of products that can be made from hemp, its seeds, its leaves, its stalks, cheaper, safer, and better than the current synthetic chemical means that many of these products are being made from. And that's what we're going to examine in the next segment of our program. Now, just to go a little bit more before we get into the products and the reasons, we have to examine how much the United States is spending right now to continue its war against marijuana. Approximately $1 billion is spent every year just to incarcerate people for marijuana offenses, and that figure comes from the latest reports released by the U.S. Department of Justice Bureau of Statistics. This is not something pulled out of a rabbit's hat. This is straight from the horse's mouth. John Walters claimed that few, if any, Americans are incarcerated for marijuana-related offenses. The reality of it is nearly 1 out of 8 prisoners locked up for drugs are locked up for pot. Another $8 billion a year is spent just on arresting those people. So now here's $9 billion a year spent on arresting and incarcerating people for marijuana. Again, I have to ask you guys, why would the United States spend $9 billion a year to fight marijuana? Why? If we look at projected tax revenues, if marijuana were legalized, we're looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of $6.2 billion a year nationwide in tax revenues. So what we're really looking at is a fiscal difference of somewhere in the neighborhood of almost $15 billion a year difference. It's $7.78 billion we wouldn't be spending, and another 6.2 we would be making. And if we can break that down state by state. The largest recipient, of course, would be California. They would have an additional $105.4 million in tax revenues. Now, this is nothing compared to what California is upside down. Arthur, I think you have that figure.
Yeah, it's $23 billion.
Okay, so, 105 million is a drop in the bucket, 23 billion, but every penny counts, as everybody who has a household budget knows. And the states go on. Alabama, 8.9 million they could expect to increase their tax revenue. Arizona, 13 million. Arkansas, 6.7. Connecticut, 9.8. And of course, the more populated the state is, like Illinois, 31.6, or Idaho, only 3.3. But every state would have an increase in their state's budget. And this is at a time when every state in the country has a projected shortfall for their general fund in 2012. There's not a state in the nation, not one, that doesn't have a projected shortfall for the next year. It's just mind-boggling that we continue to spend this kind of money against something that was never what it was portrayed as. So let's get into that a little bit, and let's look at how hemp was lumped in with marijuana. Hemp and marijuana are two different strains of the same plant. They contain two entirely different cannabinoids. The marijuana plant is high in THC. The other cannabinoid is CBD. It's actually an anti-psychoactive. You could actually call hemp the anti-marijuana, because CBD actually inhibits the body's ability or the brain's ability to attach the THC to the proper receptors in the brain. And I'm not a doctor and I'm not a scientist, but our listeners can verify all of this, what I'm saying, and it's out there. But basically, the CBD cannabinoid cancels out THC. So essentially, if I gave Arthur a joint of marijuana and he smoked it, and I turned around and gave him a joint of hemp and he smoked that, it'd cancel his buzz out. So why is hemp illegal? Why is it lumped in with marijuana? Because essentially the same products can be made from marijuana that can be made from hemp. The cannabinoids have nothing to do with that. Let's be very clear on that. You can make all the same stuff out of marijuana that you can make out of hemp, because even though chemically the plants have some differences, their fiber structure, if you will, and their seed structure are still almost identical for purposes of producing byproducts, useful byproducts. Now, here's some amazing facts about the hemp plant, and this is going to give you folks some insight as to why marijuana and hemp have been criminalized for almost 70 years. On an annual basis, 1 acre of hemp will produce as much fiber as 2 to 3 acres of cotton. Hemp is a stronger fiber, and it's softer than cotton. It lasts twice as long, and it won't mildew. Now, you would think that would be a great reason to use it, wouldn't you? They could make more money. Well, here's the thing. 50% of the world's pesticides and herbicides are used on cotton. But hemp doesn't require any of that. It doesn't require chemicals. Let's go back to DuPont. Wasn't he one of the guys that was in on this? Of course he was. DuPont still is a leader in pesticides and herbicides. Can you imagine the profit loss they would experience if all of a sudden, I mean, what farmer, if any of you live in rural areas that are listening to this broadcast, if any of your parents own farms, maybe you own a farm, maybe your neighbor does. Any of you living in rural areas know this. Not one farmer that's growing cotton in the United States of America would continue to grow cotton if he could get 2 to 3 times the yield off the same acre by growing hemp. Not one. But he's forced to grow cotton so that he can be forced to buy the poisons from DuPont that fill their corporate coffers. Okay? It still ties in today, and it's still the same companies. This is how deep this rabbit hole goes. Are you people starting to see this? Okay, on an annual basis, an acre of hemp will produce as much paper as 2 to 4 acres of trees. Everything from tissue paper to cardboard, every paper product that we use, every single one can be produced from hemp. Again, why? Why wouldn't they want to do this? Couldn't they make more money by growing the hemp on their land than the trees? Well, here's the thing. Those vast tracts of timberland that Hearst owned, if you research, you will find, and I don't have the figures here in front of me, but if you research, you will find that most of the logging operations in this country, they're not small-time operations. These are huge corporate concerns. They've owned these lands for years. They're heavily invested in this timberland. The fact that, for example, I've got 4 acres of land. I could go out and I could plant hemp on 2 of them, and it would be the same as growing 4 acres of trees every year as far as the amount of paper I could produce. And the stuff will grow anywhere. And you don't need huge, expensive equipment to harvest it. You don't need any equipment to harvest it. You can harvest it by hand. Of course, it'd be a lot easier if you had some sort of, small farm harvesting equipment. But the point is this. They've got that industry locked up. They've got the timber industry locked up. They've got the paper industry locked up. They don't want competition. If they legalize hemp, then all 50 states people could grow this stuff on their own. They could harvest it on their own. They could sell the raw materials, and they could supplement their incomes, and they could seriously curtail the profits of these huge corporate greedy bastards. It's that simple. Now, let's discuss the quality of hemp paper versus tree-based paper. Hemp paper will last 100 years without degrading, and it can be recycled numerous more times than tree-based papers, and it requires less toxic chemicals in the manufacturing process than paper made from trees does. Less toxic chemicals. That's the key word there, folks. Less toxic chemicals. Again, we go back to DuPont and the other giants who are making these chemicals. They're all tied in together. They don't want to lose the revenue from their toxic chemicals. The chemicals that are poisoning our planet, the chemicals that are poisoning our water supply, and the chemicals that are making them rich at our expense. Hemp can also be used to make a fiberboard. For those of you who don't know what fiberboard is, it's also called particle board, press wood, press board. I'm sure it's called other things in other countries. But it can be used to make a fiberboard that's stronger than wood and lighter than wood and fire retardant. Hell, substituting hemp fiberboard for timber would further reduce the need to cut down our forests. Now, personally, I'm not a huge environmentalist. I love planet Earth. I'd like to keep it green, but I'm not a zealot about it. But for those of you who are extremely concerned about the environment, you should be writing your congressman. You should be writing your senators. You should be talking to your state legislators. If hemp were decriminalized, if marijuana were decriminalized, we would not have had the big stink